My dear friends, last month someone told me, I'm not afraid of failing, I'm afraid of repeating the same life. That sentence hit me harder than any heartbreak, any disappointment, any loss. Because the truth is this, most people aren't stuck because life is hard. They're stuck because their patterns are stronger than their intentions. If you've ever woken up promising yourself, today will be different, and by night you've repeated the same habits, you know exactly what I mean. But today we break that cycle. Here are 7 powerful tips that will change your life when you act upon them. The first key point is about facing the pattern without excuses. And this is where real transformation begins. Not in motivation, not in inspiration, but in the raw honesty of confronting what you've been avoiding. Most people spend years negotiating with their own patterns, offering justifications that sound intelligent but keep them trapped. I'm busy. It's not the right time. This is just how life is for me. These aren't reasons, they're shields. Shields that protect the pattern, not you. The moment you stop explaining your behavior and start exposing it, something powerful shifts. You begin to see the pattern not as a permanent part of your personality, but as a repeated decision that can be undecided. When you take away the excuses, the pattern becomes visible in its true form, predictable, repetitive, and deeply familiar. You'll notice how it shows up the same way every time. Same triggers, same emotions, same conversations, same ending. And the strange thing is, patterns feel safe even when they hurt. They give you certainty, and certainty is addictive. You tell yourself, this is just how things are, and that sentence becomes the cage. Facing the pattern means unlatching the door that's been open all along. You don't break the pattern by fighting its strength. You break it by refusing to hide it anymore. Most of us don't fear the pattern itself. We fear what it will mean to admit we've been fueling it. That level of accountability shakes people because it forces you to look directly in the mirror without softening the reflection. But this honesty isn't cruelty, it's liberation. When you stop blaming circumstances, stop pointing at people, stop leaning on your past as a permission slip, you reclaim something you didn't realize you lost: agency. Suddenly, you're no longer the character reacting to a script. You're the author rewriting it. Facing the pattern also demands emotional courage. It requires you to sit with uncomfortable truths that you may have avoided for years. Maybe the pattern began as a coping mechanism. Maybe it started as protection. Maybe it helped you survive something. But what once helped you survive might now be keeping you from living. That realization is heavy. It's humbling. But it's also empowering, because recognizing the origin of a pattern gives you the wisdom to release it. You can honor where it came from without allowing it to dictate your future. As you confront the pattern, you must do it without exaggeration or minimization. People often tell themselves, it's not that bad, or it's already too late to change. Both statements are lies. Patterns grow in the dark, they shrink in clarity. When you shine a direct, honest light onto what's been repeating, you discover it's not as unbreakable as it felt. You begin noticing the cracks, the inconsistencies, the moments where you could have chosen differently but didn't. That awareness isn't guilt, it's guidance. It shows you exactly where your power has been hiding. And finally, facing the pattern without excuses means declaring with a full heart and steady mind, this is mine to break. Not because you caused it, not because you deserve it, but because you are the only one who can transform it. This declaration is not dramatic, it's decisive. It marks the moment you step out of passiveness and into authorship. Once you reach this point of clarity, where excuses fall silent and truth stands alone, the pattern begins to lose its grip. Not because it disappears instantly, but because you have finally stopped feeding it the one thing it cannot survive without: denial. The second key point is about interrupting the loop at its first thought. Because every pattern you've ever repeated didn't begin with action. It began with a quiet, almost invisible mental impulse. That first thought is subtle, familiar, and comfortable, which is why most people miss it. It doesn't arrive like a warning, it arrives like an invitation. Just skip it today. You can deal with that later. You've earned a break. These whispers don't sound dangerous, but they are the opening notes of a song you've danced to 1,000 times. Catching that first note is everything. The earlier you interrupt a pattern, the easier it is to redirect it. This is why awareness is your first line of defense. When you begin to observe your thoughts without immediately obeying them, you start to notice how predictable they actually are. The same excuses show up at the same time, in the same voice, with the same emotional tone. The mind loves routine, even toxic routine, because it feels familiar. Understanding this allows you to detach from the thought instead of merging with it. You see it not as a command but as a signal the loop is starting. And once you see it as a signal, you regain control of what happens next. Interrupting the loop is not about fighting your thoughts, it's about questioning them. Most negative patterns survive because you accept every thought as truth. But the moment you ask, is this thought helping me or trapping me? You break the automatic pathway. That question creates mental friction, and friction slows the loop. You give yourself a moment to think instead of reacting out of habit. And in that moment, even if it's only a few seconds long, you create a window where a different choice becomes possible. That tiny window is where freedom begins. This interruption becomes even more powerful when paired with a deliberate replacement thought. Simply saying no to a thought is not enough because the mind hates a vacuum. If you push a thought away without giving it an alternative, it returns with more force. But if you replace it with a clear counter message, something like, "This matters to me," or "I don't repeat this cycle anymore," or "I move with intention, not impulse," you redirect the mental energy toward a new path. Over time, this repetition becomes a new default signal, one that supports your growth instead of derailing it. It's important to recognize that the first thought triggering the pattern usually feels harmless, which is why most people ignore it. But ignoring it is what allows the entire chain reaction to unfold. Think of it like a match. A single match is easy to put out, but once the fire spreads, once the habit fully ignites, it becomes harder to control. Interrupting the loop early prevents the emotional burn, the behavioral slip, and the familiar regret that follows. You stop the pattern when it's weakest, not when it's roaring. This is the mistake people make. They wait until they're deep in the behavior to try to control it. By then, the thought has become emotion, and the emotion has become momentum. When you master the art of catching that first thought, you transform your entire relationship with your mind. You stop living reactively and start living consciously. Every negative pattern loses its power the moment you refuse to follow the first breadcrumb it lays out. That single interruption is not small. It's the point where destiny diverges. And each time you break the loop at its origin, you strengthen a new identity, one that is aware, intentional, and uncompromising about the direction of your life. The third key point is about replacing rather than simply removing, because the mind does not operate well in emptiness. It clings to whatever is familiar, even if that familiarity is destructive. When people try to break negative patterns by abruptly stopping them, they often experience a rebound effect. The mind panics when its routine is disrupted without a clear alternative, so it pulls you back to the very behavior you're trying to escape. That's why eliminating a pattern without replacing it almost guarantees its return. True transformation doesn't come from rejection alone, it comes from strategic substitution. You don't just pull the weeds out, you plant something stronger in their place. Consider how habits form. Most negative patterns begin as coping mechanisms, filling emotional or mental gaps, boredom, stress, loneliness, fear, self-doubt. If you remove the behavior but leave the emotional gap unaddressed, the mind will search for something, anything to fill it. Sometimes the replacement is just another unhealthy pattern in disguise. But when you consciously choose what to replace the old behavior with, you guide the mind instead of letting it wander. This prevents the vacuum that often sucks people straight back into old cycles. The power lies not in what you stop doing, but in what you choose to do instead. Replacement is also essential because the brain is wired to conserve energy. Familiar habits require less mental effort, while new ones demand more attention and focus. When you replace a pattern with a new action, you create a parallel pathway, one that over time becomes easier and more automatic. This shift doesn't happen by force, it happens by repetition. Every time you choose the replacement, you weaken the old pattern's hold and strengthen the new one's roots. Slowly, the brain begins to prefer the healthier route because it becomes more efficient. You're not fighting your biology, you're training it. The key is choosing replacements that genuinely fulfill the need behind the old habit. If your negative pattern helped you escape stress, the replacement must give you relief without creating collateral damage. If it soothed your loneliness, the replacement must offer real connection instead of temporary distraction. This is where self-awareness becomes crucial. You have to ask yourself, what was this behavior giving me? And how can I meet that need in a healthier way? When you solve the need rather than suppress the behavior, the pattern loses relevance. It no longer has a reason to return because its purpose has been replaced, not ignored. Replacement also provides momentum. When people only focus on stopping something, they're stuck in defense mode, constantly trying not to do something. That approach drains energy, creates frustration, and often leads to guilt when slip-ups happen. But when you focus on what you are doing instead, what you are building, what you are practicing, you shift into offense. You move towards something instead of away from something. This change in perspective creates enthusiasm, purpose, and progress. And progress, even small progress, is incredibly motivating. It keeps you engaged, hopeful, and committed. Ultimately, replacing rather than removing turns transformation into a creative act rather than a restrictive one. You're not depriving yourself, you're upgrading yourself. You're not punishing your mind, you're teaching it a better way to function. And each time you choose the replacement behavior, you reinforce a new identity, one that acts with intention instead of impulse. Breaking a pattern is not about emptying your life of the old, it's about filling your life with the new, deliberately, consistently, and powerfully. The fourth key point is about building tiny wins that rewire your identity, because real, lasting change rarely begins with dramatic breakthroughs. It begins with quiet victories that accumulate until they become undeniable. People underestimate small actions because they don't look impressive, but the brain doesn't care about size, it cares about consistency. Every time you follow through on a tiny commitment, your mind receives evidence, I can trust myself. And that trust is the foundation of transformation. When you create a pattern of small wins, you create a pattern of self-belief. You're not waiting for motivation to strike, you're generating momentum through action. Small wins matter because they bypass the resistance that often blocks big goals. When you aim for something massive, your brain triggers fear, doubt, and overwhelm. But when you choose something so small it feels almost effortless, your mind relaxes. There's no internal argument, no emotional battle, no dramatic build-up. You just do it. And that simple act of doing begins to shift the way you see yourself. You're no longer the person who plans but never executes. You become the person who takes action, even if it's small. Over time, that identity becomes stronger than any old pattern trying to pull you back. Tiny wins are powerful because they accumulate quietly. You might not notice the shift at first, but the brain is rewiring beneath the surface. New neural pathways form every time you follow through, making the new behavior easier and more automatic. It's like carving a path through a forest. The first few steps feel awkward, but with repetition, the path becomes clearer, smoother, and eventually the default route. Meanwhile, the old pathway, the negative pattern, begins to fade from lack of use. You're not forcing change, you're redirecting your mind step by step. Another strength of tiny wins is that they build emotional resilience. When you attempt something huge and fail, it can break your confidence. But when you complete small tasks consistently, you build an emotional buffer that protects you from discouragement. You develop the ability to recover quickly, to adjust without collapsing, to keep moving without feeling defeated. Resilience becomes a shield against setbacks. Instead of thinking, I messed up, so I might as well give up, you think, I slipped, but I know how to start small again. That mindset is what keeps transformation sustainable. Tiny wins also reconnect you with your sense of agency. In a world where everything demands urgency, perfection, and speed, small wins remind you that growth is still within your control. You don't need the perfect schedule, the perfect resources, or the perfect timing. You just need one action, one choice, one step. This simplicity reduces stress, increases clarity, and grounds you in the present moment. And when you feel in control, even in a small way, you stop waiting for external circumstances to change and start taking responsibility for your own direction. Ultimately, building tiny wins is about becoming the kind of person whose actions align with their vision. The habit of achieving small victories rewires your identity from passive to purposeful. You stop seeing yourself as someone stuck in cycles and start seeing yourself as someone who breaks them. Every small win becomes a message to your mind: I am capable, I am consistent, I am evolving. And when that identity becomes ingrained, negative patterns lose their power. Not because they disappear, but because they no longer match the person you are becoming. Fifth key point is about detaching from environments that recycle your old self. Because no matter how strong your intentions are, the spaces you occupy have the power to pull you back into versions of you that you've outgrown. People underestimate how deeply environments shape behavior. A room, a routine, a relationship. Each one carries its own emotional gravity. You might feel motivated, inspired, ready to transform, but the moment you step into an environment that mirrors your past, your old patterns come alive again. Not because you're weak, but because the environment is coded with the cues, triggers, and expectations of who you used to be. When you walk into the same space, you unconsciously step into the same role. Detaching means breaking that silent agreement. What many don't realize is that environments store memory. A couch where you always procrastinated. A friend who always encouraged your bad habits. A workspace where you always felt overwhelmed. Your body remembers. Your thoughts remember. Your emotions remember. When you return to these familiar environments, the old neural pathways activate automatically. Suddenly, you're thinking the same thoughts, speaking the same words, making the same choices, not because you want to, but because the environment nudges you into autopilot. Detaching from these environments isn't about abandoning your life, it's about refusing to live on mental repeat. Sometimes the environment is not physical, it's emotional. Certain people, no matter how much they say they care, only know you as the version of yourself who struggled, who doubted, who settled. They talk to that version, expect that version, and treat you like that version. And if you're not careful, you become that version around them. Transformation often requires stepping away from relationships that anchor you to your past, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Because growth demands space to speak differently, to act differently, to think differently without being dragged back by the expectations of others. Detaching from limiting environments also reveals how much influence surroundings have over motivation. When you place yourself in environments that align with your growth, quiet, intentional, uplifting, you naturally behave in alignment with your goals. But when you remain in environments that contradict your transformation, you're constantly battling invisible resistance. Imagine trying to climb a mountain while someone ties your ankles to the ground. That's what happens when your environment doesn't match your direction. The harder you push, the stronger the pullback feels. Detachment cuts the rope. This detachment, however, doesn't always mean a dramatic exit. Sometimes it means rearranging your space so it doesn't carry the energy of old habits. Sometimes it means redefining the tone of conversations with people who have known you for years. Sometimes it means creating micro-environments, small corners, new routines, new rituals that support your evolution. The key is intentionality. You must consciously build environments that reflect the person you're becoming, not the person you've been. Even subtle changes can disrupt old triggers and create new mental associations. Ultimately, detaching from environments that recycle your old self is an act of self-respect. It's declaring that your growth deserves protection. It's choosing spaces that nourish your becoming instead of suffocating it. When you step into environments that align with your transformation, your actions follow naturally. your mindset shifts, your habits strengthen, and your identity evolves in ways that cannot be undone. This is how you rise, not just by changing your mind, but by changing the world around you so it reflects the life you're working to create. The sixth key point is about rewriting the story you keep repeating to yourself, because every pattern, no matter how stubborn, survives on the narrative running silently in your mind. You can change your schedule, your habits, your environment, but if the story you tell yourself is still rooted in limitation, your life will always orbit around that script. Most people don't even realize they're carrying an internal monologue that shapes their choices. I'm always like this. I never get it right. That's just who I am. These stories feel harmless, but they are the architecture of your identity. When you rewrite that narrative, you don't just change your thoughts. You change the entire foundation of how you see yourself. Your internal story becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the brain wants consistency. If your story says you're someone who quits when things get tough, your mind will subtly guide you toward quitting to keep the story true. If your story says you're unworthy, you'll unconsciously choose people and situations that reflect that belief. The brain doesn't fight to protect your potential. It fights to protect your narrative. That is why rewriting the story is not optional. It is essential. If you don't shift the internal script, you will always revert to the familiar roles you've been rehearsing for years, even when those roles sabotage your growth. Rewriting your story begins with recognizing the voice behind it. Most of the stories people carry are not their own. They're inherited echoes of someone else's words. A parent who told you to be realistic, a teacher who underestimated you, a partner who made you feel small, a mistake that convinced you you're incapable. These external comments become internal truths not because they're accurate, but because they were repeated in moments when you were vulnerable. But the moment you identify where the story came from, you regain the authority to challenge it. You realize the voice in your head is not a prophecy, it's a memory. And memories can be reinterpreted. When you rewrite your story, you're not pretending reality is different. You're redefining what reality means to you. Instead of saying, I always fail, you shift to, I've failed, but I've also learned. Instead of saying, I'm not disciplined, you shift to, I'm becoming disciplined one choice at a time. Instead of saying, that's just how I am, you shift to, this is who I was, not who I'm becoming. These shifts may seem subtle, but they alter the emotional tone of your inner world. You go from feeling powerless to feeling responsible. From seeing yourself as fixed to seeing yourself as evolving. The story doesn't have to be dramatic. The seventh key point is about committing to the future version of you, not the familiar one. Because true transformation doesn't happen when you react to who you've been, it happens when you begin showing up for the person you're becoming. Most people stay stuck because they remain loyal to their past selves. They make choices based on old fears, old insecurities, old beliefs, and old identities that no longer reflect where they want to go. But growth requires a different kind of loyalty to the future. That means making decisions today that honor the person you want to be tomorrow. Every pattern you break, every habit you form, every boundary you create becomes a vote for that future version of you. To commit to the future version of yourself, you must first imagine them clearly, not as a fantasy, but as a blueprint. Who is that person? How do they speak? How do they think? How do they handle stress, disappointment, opportunities, relationships, responsibilities? When you visualize the future you give your mind a direction, a target, a destination. Without this clarity, you're left drifting, reacting, and repeating. But when the future you becomes vivid, you start aligning your choices with that identity. You begin trading temporary comfort for long-term alignment. You stop asking, what do I feel like doing? And start asking, what would my future self choose? This commitment also demands courage, because the future version of you will require actions that feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity often feels uncomfortable. You'll be tempted to retreat into old behaviors, not because they're better, but because they're known. But the unfamiliar is where evolution happens. Every time you choose the action that feels slightly beyond your comfort zone, You're stepping into the space where the future you already exists. That discomfort is not a sign you're on the wrong path, it's a sign you're shedding an old identity. Growth rarely feels natural at first because you're becoming someone you've never been before. Committing to your future self also means setting standards that reflect that identity. The future you probably doesn't tolerate certain patterns, certain conversations, certain environments, certain excuses. So you begin raising your standards, not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. You stop accepting behaviors that contradict your vision. You stop giving energy to things that drain your potential. You stop allowing people to pull you into emotional spaces you've already healed from. This is not about perfection, it's about congruence. Your standards become a filter that keeps you anchored to your future, not your past. Another powerful aspect of this commitment is recognizing that the future you is built through repetition, not occasional bursts of inspiration. You don't become that version of yourself through one big decision. You become them through hundreds of small ones. Choosing discipline when excuses feel louder, choosing honesty when avoidance feels easier, choosing growth when comfort feels tempting. Each choice becomes a brick in the foundation of your future identity. And as the bricks stack, something incredible happens. The future you stops feeling distant. They start feeling inevitable. Ultimately, committing to the future version of yourself transforms the way you navigate the present. You no longer make decisions based on fear, insecurity, or familiarity. You make them based on destiny. You act like the person you're becoming until your mind, your habits, your relationships, and your reality adjust to match that version. This is how you break patterns at the deepest level, not by focusing on what you're running from, but by focusing on who you're running toward. When the future you becomes your reference point, your anchor, your compass, the past no longer has the power to pull you back. When you look at all these points together, you begin to see something powerful. Breaking negative patterns isn't about sudden miracles or overnight turnarounds. It's about reclaiming ownership of your life, piece by piece, choice by choice, moment by moment. You're not fighting a monster outside of you. You're reshaping the patterns within you that were built over years. And that means you have far more power than you've ever realized. Because once you face your patterns without excuses, once you interrupt the loop at its first whisper, once you replace what no longer serves you, once you stack tiny wins until they become identity, once you detach from environments that shrink you, once you rewrite the story that defines you, and once you commit fully, fiercely to the future version of yourself, everything changes, not instantly, not magically, but intentionally. Your life begins to shift in ways you can feel, first in small ripples, then in undeniable waves. You start waking up differently. You start speaking differently. You start choosing differently. Not because you're forcing change, but because you've become someone for whom those old patterns simply don't fit anymore. And the most powerful truth of all is this: you are not doomed to repeat your past. You are designed to grow beyond it. If you're willing to take these steps, not perfectly but consistently, you will not recognize your life a few months from now. The cycle will break, the pattern will fade, and you will rise into a version of yourself that feels authentic, empowered, and finally free. Your next chapter is waiting, and it does not have to look anything like the last one.